Welcome back. Well, as expected, as you saw just a moment ago, the Basic Education Department confirming this morning government schools will now only reopen for children on the 15th of February. In other words, if you're a parent, and I am, there's another month of school holidays. Of course, that's because of the second wave of COVID-19 and the rising number of infections and deaths that we've seen. Now, in the first wave of the disease, you'll remember the scientists and the doctors told us children were not badly affected by the virus. But there is a new variant, and it does appear to infect younger people more than the first variant did. Professor Haroon Salaji is an executive member of the South African Pediatric Association. Professor, good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. At this stage, do we know if this new variant of the disease, the new variant that we have here in South Africa, is it affecting children or younger people more than the first variant of COVID-19 did?
So, Stephen, that's quite a difficult question to answer. But what we do know is that the question should be, is it perhaps discordantly affecting children compared to adults previously? So what we knew previously is that obviously the virus was affecting adults much more than children. And so we've looked at some of the data, particularly from November, when perhaps a new variant came through, and looked to data through to last week to see what's it doing. And what we found is that from November, middle of November till now, we had 6 times more infections of COVID in adults than previously. So in other words, now in the first week of January compared to November. In children, this is children under the age of 18, it's gone up by twice. So clearly the numbers of increase of coronavirus have increased both in adults and in children. But as in the previous time, in the previous strain, we're still finding the discordance is adults are 5 times higher while children have gone up 2 times. So we don't have any strong evidence that children are being discordantly affected. The other point, of course, is hospitalizations, and we see the same trends in hospitalizations. We knew children were less likely to get ill and get hospitalized, and we see the same trends in hospital admissions as well, that even the adolescents are not being discordantly affected. They're nowhere near the kind of admissions to adults. So to summarize, obviously the new variant is a dangerous variant. But there's very little evidence to say that it's affecting children much more than the previous version of the virus.
I mean, that would suggest then that children still, at this stage, with the new variant, which I think is now the dominant variant in at least 3 provinces, is actually, children are frankly much safer than adults still.
Absolutely. So both in terms of incidence, a number of new cases happening, and in terms of severity, admissions to hospitals, we find children are much less likely to be infected and to be hospitalized.
So, I mean, this feeds into the conversation about schools. I remember speaking to you and your colleagues at the beginning, in the middle of the first wave, and I realize a lot's changed and that there are important reasons as to why that is. Some of your colleagues seem to suggest that schools should stay open, that it was the wrong decision to leave schools closed for quite as long as they were closed. How do you feel about it now?
So you may remember from our previous conversation that the organization I belong to, the South African Pediatric Association, we were strongly in favor of schools remaining open. And I think that view prevailed in the end. We supported the education department. And I think the evidence suggests that we were right in that decision. If one looks at what has happened with transmission rates before schools opened, when schools were open, and when schools closed, we find that when schools were open, there was no spike of corona infection in the country. So it didn't make a big difference in terms of community transmission. And that's exactly what we said. So then the question is, has the situation changed? Are things different with this new variant? And our view hasn't changed. We still believe that the appropriate action now is that children should be going back to school. And so we strongly supported the idea that the school should open on the 27th of January. We believe that's the appropriate response, and we believe that that's what should have happened. And in fact, the postponement by 2 weeks is a wrong decision. It's misguided. It's not based on the scientific evidence.
I mean, it's a strong view that you're expressing on a very complex question of governance. I mean, the other question that I think I need to ask, and just get your view as a doctor, as a scientist on this, is around the possibility of teachers being infected by children. Now, teachers are not the only people who would have to work if schools were open. I mean, cashiers have to work. I mean, you and I are working right now, Professor. I realize that teachers in particular might be vulnerable in that they're dealing with children. They're dealing in some cases in quite crowded situations. Some schools don't have proper sanitation facilities. I accept all of that. But with the new variant, is there evidence that teachers would be more vulnerable to contracting the disease from children, especially if the new variant came from the rage parties which involved 17, 18, 19-year-olds?
So the simple answer, Stephen, is we don't know, because the current epidemic has happened during school holidays, most of it. And so we don't know what the effects will be. We know two facts, however. The one issue that we've known from before is that teachers that have been infected in South Africa and around the world are very unlikely to have been infected at schools. The vast majority of teachers have received it through what's called community spread. In other words, wherever they lived, being in the malls, what have you. I mean, different studies have given different numbers, but probably at most about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 teachers have got it at school. But that's a very high estimate. So the evidence is very clear. The children, and it remains true for this variant, that children, firstly, don't acquire the disease as easily. There's just been a big Icelandic study, 40,000, where the number they've put is children are half as likely to get corona as adults. But more importantly, that same study said children are half as likely to transmit it. And so we know that when teachers get the infection, it's very unlikely that they've got it from children in the school. It's much more likely they got it at home or in the community. And it's more likely they may have got it from another teacher. So that still remains the case, that children are not the vector of this disease. And so the critical point here, and why we feel so strongly why schools should be open, is that where does transmission occur of this virus and how much of it occurs at schools? And the view is that it's still a very small percentage, perhaps 5%. There's different studies again. About 5% of transmission happens at school, and 95% of transmission happens in the community. So if you are a teacher, you're going to get it not because you're going to school, but you're much, much more likely because you're in the community and doing the things that we're doing. And I think the evidence is there. We've seen this peak come through during school holidays, but it hasn't spared teachers. And so I can understand teachers are afraid that this is what's going to happen. And teachers' unions are making the point, we don't want our teachers to be infected. But I think the point we've been at pains to stress is that, yes, there is an increased risk. Yes, in the presence of this new strain, there's a higher risk than before. But it's not the kind of risk that every teacher is going to get it. It's a small additional risk to what's happening already. And so I'm afraid we haven't bought the argument that teachers are highly vulnerable and because of the new strain or because of the heightened epidemic.
Professor Haroon Salaji, thank you very much indeed. Executive member of the South African Paediatric Association. Well, a strong view there on a complex topic, perhaps one of the most difficult governance topics that there is during a time of COVID-19. We'll have other conversations around schools for you. Electricity at schools, new information coming through around the lack of electricity at many schools around the country, but also the dropout rate, which skyrocketed last year as a result of the long closure. At the same time, if you're the Basic Education Department, if you're the Minister, would you open schools or would you not? It's such a difficult conversation.